It's been over a third of a century now since Ronald Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act on August 13th of 1981 and initiated the supply-side revolution. And it's hard now to remember just how revolutionary it was at the time, and what mockery Reagan endured while campaigning for president on the theory that government should get out of the way and let the economy create wealth instead of taking responsibility for it. Ever since the early 1930s, people have been convinced that it was up to government to make sure that we were prosperous, that private firms were somehow short-sighted, stupid, greedy, and destroyed wealth rather than creating it. But Reagan rejected all of that, including the Keynesian magic formula that from the early 60s had said, in hard times, governments stimulate the economy by running deficits. In good times, they cool down the overheated machine by running surpluses, and that there was meant to be a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Now, by the late 1970s, it was obvious that Keynesianism was rubbish because unemployment and inflation were both very high. Yet somehow that didn't bother the great and good. They were so convinced that government was the key to our happiness and that Reagan and his supporters were hicks and rubes. But Reagan signed the ERTA, also known as Kemp-Roth, and then there was another tax reform in 1986, and by golly, the American economy boomed, including the personal computer revolution. At a certain point, everybody started to become tax cutters. Now, it's true, Reagan was not as successful in fighting spending. The American government continued to get bigger. It's just that with more tax revenue, there was more room for it to expand. You win some and you lose some. Nevertheless, it changed the world, or changed it back to the notion that it was the private sector that created wealth. So what happened? What has happened to us? After all that experience, when hard times hit in 2008, every government, the American government, the British government, the Canadian government, lunged for the Keynesian tools and started running deficits and claimed they saved us from ourselves or purple dragons or whatever it was. How did we forget that Keynesianism produced stagflation and that supply-side economics produced a very long boom, extraordinary innovation, and rising wealth for just about everybody? Well, maybe it's time to remember it again, to dust off our copies of Jude Wanniski's The Way the World Works and go back to the notion that government doesn't create wealth, private entrepreneurship does, and start cutting tax rates instead of trying to stimulate particular sectors of the economy, and give up the notion that politicians are magicians who can make us all rich if we just leave the job to them.